cultural aberration is only intelligible in the context of existing social systems. By analyzing that which is regarded as transgressive then, one is able to reconstruct the cultural value systems out of which the behaviors emerge and against which the behaviors transgress.
I have this folder on my computer desktop called Death Threats.
Okay, so last time we took a look at the incident that struck the spark that eventually became the raging fire that is the Gregory Allen Elliott Twitter harassment trial. And anyone who hasn't watched that video, I'm going to link it in the low bar. You should actually go watch that before watching this one. Now, to understand exactly how the fire got so out of control, we need to look at the conditions and the climate in which that spark occurred. Now, this whole idea of conditions and climate, that kind of hit home for me this summer because I spent part of it in BC, and in BC at that time, there were massive wildfires caused by drought and extremely high temperatures. So bad were the conditions that one of these huge fires that started was purported to have been started by the sun shining through a glass bottle that had been tossed into a ditch along the side of a highway. So really we're talking about conditions that are primed for ignition. And there are moments in human history when the human condition ends up to, being ripe for ignition. It just either just through what's naturally going on in the environment or through manipulation, that human beings can be provoked into all kinds of really egregious behavior that they would not otherwise engage in. And the consequences of a spark, when it comes randomly or intentionally, they don't ever really seem to be anything good. Now, when it comes to the Elliott case, we got to look at a few things, sort of the general state of the gender discourse in mainstream society and media, Toronto's political climate, and particularly a political organization called Witopoly, which was founded and is run by complainant number one in this case, Steph Guthrie. Now, one of the things that really caught my eye when I was putting together my first video on this topic was this particular claim by the Huffington Post. Now, in reality, there's nothing new or innovative about people simulating violence against hated public figures, or in ritually destroying things that offend them that happen to be attached or related to people that annoy them. The ritual destruction of effigies has been a form of political protest and a display of hostility against certain public and historical figures for centuries. Guy Fawkes Night in the UK is a wonderful example of this phenomenon, particularly considering the occasional inclusion on those occasions of effigies of the Pope, who I'm pretty sure never plotted to blow up Parliament. And so is the tearing down of statues of Saddam Hussein when his regime was overthrown. I'm sure we all remember those sort of iconic scenes in the media when Hussein was overthrown of people tearing down those statues. So, more mundanely, the dartboard of hate is such a well-worn fictional trope, it's even featured on a dedicated page on the website TV Tropes with a litany of examples from popular culture ranging from kids' shows to fan art. Notable kid-friendly examples of ritualized violence against effigies would include Yzma from The Emperor's New Groove smashing busts of Emperor Cusco with a humorously oversized mallet, Hades destroying Hercules' merch in a fit of rage, and one of the Olsen twins accidentally throwing darts at a picture of her own face after a falling out with her sister. Notable examples from real life include Sinead O'Connor ritually destroying a picture of the Pope on stage, and Alex Lifshitz, our favorite SJW, destroying a copy of Grand Theft Auto 5 in ritual fashion in front of a room full of feminists and SJWs at a conference. Now, more specific to the Elliott case, face punch games like Bendel and Spur's Beat Up Anita Sarkeesian abound on the internet. gotta say is, poor Justin Bieber. And even Anita Sarkeesian hasn't been reluctant to get in on that action. She posted a piece of fiction written by a fan of hers wherein Anita murders real-life game developer Randy Pitchford in cold blood while he begs for mercy and vows to change his wicked, misogynistic ways. She posted this on her blog. She was so proud of the fact that someone had gone to the trouble to write her this piece of fan fiction. So clearly this type of behavior has a long and storied tradition on and offline and is nothing novel or innovative. So what exactly made the Punch Anita Sarkeesian game so special that it inspired a vigilante mob response by Guthrie and her Twitter followers? Well, it arrived on the coattails of a broader cultural discussion of misogyny and the harassment of women, particularly online. Articles and news stories abounded in mainstream media on that subject at that time, many of them spurred by Sarkeesian's descriptions of the cyber mob that had gone after her, but some of them predating her arrival at the forefront of the discussion. Feminists like Quinn Norton were busy claiming, without qualification or caveat, that the source of the problem of harassment of women online is that men are raised to hate women, and mainstream interviewers merely nod like sage, all-knowing bobbleheads without asking a single difficult question. You know, like, well, who exactly is raising men to hate women? You know, for the last several decades, more boys and girls alike have been raised by single mothers than at any point in history, and they're cared for and educated almost entirely by female daycare staff and teachers. If men are being raised to hate women, who's raising them to feel this way? Likewise, it would only be a month after Guthrie sicked the internet on Ben Spur that Helen Lewis would articulate the weak sauce, unfalsifiable circular logic that later became known as Lewis's Law. The comments on any article about feminism justify feminism. And if only Goebbels had a degree in communications, he could have maybe come up with something just as effective for the Nazis. So intense was the discussion at this time about how mean the internet is to women and women alone, it would only be a year later that Women Action and Media would be given broad discretionary powers by Facebook to determine what content is and is not appropriate and acceptable on that site. Not long after that, Wham also managed to insinuate itself into the inner workings of Twitter, determining what is and is not harassment and sexism in that community. To their credit, Wham has actually released some data from their study of Twitter that is not entirely in line with the broader feminist narrative, so kudos to them. Anyway, most of the commentary on this particular topic has examined the problem through a feminist lens. That is, the go-to assumption is that hateful or abusive comments to or about a woman, particularly a feminist woman, are primarily motivated by the hatred of women, the systemic hatred of women. Even when the motivation is not misogyny, the behavior is inherently considered misogynistic because it is directed toward a woman. In the case of feminist women, this connection is particularly easy to make in the minds of observers because feminists claim to be advocating on behalf of the well-being and interests of women as a class or group. A feminist woman is woman in concrete terms and woman in the abstract. She is woman as biology and woman as policy. An attack on her is an attack on the concept of woman itself, on women's progress, on women's well-being, and on women's safety. As their reasoning goes, why would someone hate on a person like Anita Sarkeesian who advocates for women if they didn't hate women, the people she claims to be advocating on behalf of? In this way, women as a class act as both a smokescreen and a bulletproof vest, protecting feminists from the consequences of their own bad behavior, even when it's aimed toward other women. Now, Ben Spur got it kinda sorta right when he claimed in his preamble that Anita hides from criticism behind her vagina. But only kinda sorta, because it's not just her vagina. She's hiding behind all women's vaginas. She's hiding behind all women and claiming that attacking her is attacking all women, and is therefore indicative of systemic hatred of women. Now, of course, amid the lunacy, there were voices of reason in the discussion of the internet's alleged particular and targeted hatred of women in general, but such articles were few and far between, posted mostly on right-of-center news sites, and easily dismissed by progressive media as misogynistic in and of themselves. Because to deny the existence of rampant systemic societal and institutional misogyny is in itself an expression of misogyny. After all, in the Kafkaesque world of feminism where no correct answer exists, declaring oneself guilty might win you clemency if you beg and apologize enough. But declaring oneself innocent is, well, that's just what a really guilty person would say, don't you know? If you deny the problem, you're perpetuating it, and if you're perpetuating it, you're harming women. The labyrinth only has one exit, folks, and surprise, surprise, all roads lead to misogyny. Now, of course, the reality is that both men and women online receive abusive, threatening, and hostile comments. A survey of journalists in Sweden found that men receive more such feedback overall, including threats of death, violence, and vandalism, than women do. While women were more likely to receive rape threats, for instance, men were more likely to receive threats of death, arson, or the murder of family members. Where a troll might tell a woman to show me your tits, that same troll might tell a man he's got a tiny penis or obviously can't get laid. Other similar research has replicated these findings regarding celebrities and public figures such as politicians and journalists on Twitter. In one of them, Piers Morgan alone received so much online abuse as to skew all the findings considerably. Don't know how Andy Dick manages either.
Can it be my turn to punch Andy Dick until there's bones in his stool?
I'm almost positive Ann Coulter gets her fair share of hate online, but she's probably no more inundated than Rush Limbaugh. Why, it's almost as if trolls and angry commenters can intuit just what kind of insult or threat will upset someone based on who they are, what they seem to care about, and what they look like. They'll tell Coulter she's an anorexic gender traitor bitch with internalized misogyny who deserves to be raped, and they'll tell Limbaugh, I hope someone murders you and your family, you fat fuck. So very different, no? Yet the narrative over the last several years is that online abuse, trolling, and harassment not only happen much more to women than to men, but that it happens to women because they're women. That is, there is a component of systemic sexism and gender hatred in the motivations of trolls and harassers who target women that does not exist when the targets are men, even if and when men are more likely to be targeted. So when feminists make these claims that any abusive feedback online is a concerted attempt to silence half the population, the modus operandi in the mainstream is to smile, nod, and go to print. Any and all dissent or questioning of the narrative, well, that's just proof of how deeply rooted this systemic misogyny is. After all, the more you protest your innocence, the more you advertise your guilt. So essentially, Spur's video arrived at a moment when the mainstream, both the media and the culture, had already been convinced that women, particularly feminist women, being treated with similar harshness and hostility online as men are, is caused by and expressive of pervasive misogyny and sexism. And Sarkeesian, with her history in PR and communications, managed to spin all the flack she received as part of a pervasive patriarchal campaign to silence half the population and to elevate herself to the status of benevolent feminist martyr. Frankly, I doubt she had to work very hard at it, since the progressive media was already spinning an agenda identical to hers. That anything bad that someone says or does to a woman, no matter the reason or the circumstances, must be motivated by a hatred of women as a group, simply because of the fact that she's a woman. Now I'm guessing, given Spur's socioeconomic status, his occupation, education, and hobbies, that he probably hadn't been paying very close attention to the cultural climate within the progressive media until he put his foot in it. Until Sarkeesian came along, video games had remained largely unmolested by the cultural behemoth that is feminism, and the other communities that had already taken a battering, atheism, skepticism, campus life, student unions. I would presume these hostile takeovers would be way off the radar for someone like Spur. He had no idea what he was in for when he made that game. And he had no idea what he would come up against regarding the local political climate in Toronto either. On May 30th, 2012, Steph Guthrie's organization, Witopoly, hosted an event called The Front Page, which included a panel discussion on how women in politics are discussed on social media, particularly Twitter. Two Toronto city councillors, Shelley Carroll and Kristen Wong-Tam, participated. Their contributions to the discussion were interesting. Wong-Tam's apparent conflation of being called a bad word, FYI, it was cunt, with being threatened was intriguing in a Sarkeesian-esque way, but it was Carroll's lament. Where are our cyberbullies? Why aren't we bullying people that say things like that really raised my eyebrows. This far left-leaning feminist city councillor openly and clearly advocated the dogpiling and bullying over social media of people with whom she disagrees. I have the feeling that this is a woman who would champion cyberbullying laws that have, come into effect or been proposed since the Rehtaeh Parsons suicide, and other high-profile cases of children and young teens committing suicide due to being bullied online, and yet here she is advocating bullying. Interesting, too, in a kind of unintentionally ironic way, was the example she gave of a comment that should be called out by said cyberbullying: the Toronto budget chief's dismissal of requests for additional spending using the phrase widows and orphans. Now, from the website changingminds.org, widows and orphans doesn't actually refer to real widows and orphans. It simply covers the politics of three different political strategies. 1, get the sympathy vote by showing how you are helping those less fortunate than yourself. 2, alternatively show how what the other person is suggesting will hurt those innocents. And 3, play to the crowd, add some drama. If there are others there, play to them as well. So, in a sense, this Toronto budget chief was accusing Shelley Carroll of exploiting widows and orphans. And essentially, Carroll was spinning the budget chief's characterization of her politics, a cynical exploitation of vulnerable people to get votes and badmouth opponents, and she was using it to badmouth him as not caring about vulnerable people. It's like Inception. About a month later, on the 6th of July, Guthrie took Councillor Carroll's advice. When she read on HuffPo about the latest bullying exercise to hit the web and discovered Spur's Twitter handle, she sent the following tweet to her followers. So, I found the Twitter account of that fuck listed as creator of the punch a woman in the face game. Should I sick the internet on him? On a side note, observe the language here. Not punch Anita Sarkeesian in the face. Punch a woman in the face. Any woman. Every woman. The wording of that tweet. Punch a woman. Your mother, your daughter, your wife in the face. Perfectly articulated the cultural norm Guthrie wanted others to perceive that Spur was transgressing.
Bendel Spur had convinced himself that creating a video game simulating the brutalization of a feminist he disagreed with was not misogynist.
And Spur's response to the tweets Guthrie directed at him? Well, they were responses that I would have made. Again, what anyone with any moral consistency would say. Hating one woman does not imply that you hate all women, nor should a face punch game be automatically perceived as misogynistic just because the target is female. Yet Guthrie is either incapable of understanding this, or chose not to acknowledge it. And in that moment, Guthrie and her followers became the ultimate objectifiers of women. In that moment, Guthrie and her followers prioritized a woman's sex over her speech, her ideas, her accomplishments, and her actions. By describing Sarkeesian as a woman, and characterizing by default any negative reaction to her ideas and behavior as misogyny, they have rendered everything other than Sarkeesian's sex irrelevant. Her vagina was suddenly the most important thing about her. And the sad thing is how few progressives can actually see how dehumanizing that is to women. But that is maybe a topic for another day. Suffice to say that her community almost unanimously agreed that their norms had been transgressed, and they almost unanimously agreed that the internet should be sicked on the transgressor. Guthrie, who described herself as heart in throat due to her understanding of just what she was about to unleash on Bendel and Spur, tweeted, Hey, at Bendelin, do you punch women in the face in real life or just on the internet? This guy made the Anita Sarkeesian face punch game. Others retweet. Spur responded, at Am I Right, folks? Of course, I would never hit a person in real life outside of self-defense. Physical assault is a disgusting crime. And in Guthrie's very own storify of her conversation with Bendelin Spur was this lonesome, moderate, reasonable tweet. At Am I Right, folks? Hey, at Bendelin. Why not make a creative game to discuss your concerns? Your talents can educate and debate instead of hate. The author of that tweet? Gregory Allen Elliott. Not so moderate or reasonable were Guthrie and her followers, and eventually Elliott was moved to object to the concerted campaign of harassment they euphemistically described as call-out culture. And the more Elliott attempted to point out the wrong-headedness and cruelty in what they were doing, the more they dug in their heels, and the more Guthrie saw him as an enemy. Now, Elliott already had a long history on Twitter of calling political figures out on their bullshit and nepotistic shenanigans, and he already had a reputation for not shutting up when he saw someone, particularly a public figure, doing something immoral, corrupt, or unjust. To him, Guthrie was just another politico misbehaving with apparent impunity, and he chose not to be silent. Unfortunately for him, he, like Spur, had no idea what he was putting his foot in when he turned his attention to someone who just happened to have a vagina, a head full of feminist dogma, and a willingness to abuse the judicial process to make him go away. Anyway, that's it for this time. In a day or two, on September 4th, legal counsel in this case will once again be before the judge, this time arguing as to whether the Crown Counsel should be allowed to amend their initial charges even after the trial has had its conclusion. The proposed amendment, adding recklessness to the charge of harassment, a factor not mentioned by the prosecution for the entirety of the trial, right up until her closing arguments, where she claimed that Elliott knowingly harassed the complainants, and if he did not know, he should have known, and therefore acted recklessly. So essentially, she is seeking to add another charge, add a second crime to the docket after the trial has been concluded. So we'll see what the judge has to say about that in a couple of days, and you can read more on that particular circumstance, that particular event happening, and all of the details at a link to Genuine Witty's website, which I will leave in the low bar. And I guess that's it for me for now, and sorry if I've been a little fuzzy in this video. I've got a really bad cold right now, and it's just like killing me, but I was finally well enough and presentable enough to actually shoot the video today, so I figured I'd better get on it, particularly with September 4th coming up right away. So anyhow, I will see you all later. Thanks for listening.